Welcome, everybody. My name is Vangelis Calotychos. Along with my colleague at Brown University, Yannis Hamilakis, we thank the collective of the Decolonize Elas project for asking us to convene the initiative's thematic cluster devoted to coloniality, race, and nation in modern Greece. We acknowledge also the support of the Decolonial Initiative at Brown University for this panel. At today's session, we've chosen to focus, along with my colleague at Brown University, Yannis Hamilakis, we thank the collective of the Are you hearing the return? Project for asking us to convene the initiative's thematic cluster. There's a return, race, and nation in modern Greece. We acknowledge also the support of the Decolonial Initiative at Brown University for this panel. At today's session, we've chosen to focus, along with my colleague. Okay. I hope we'll overcome some of these problems. I think we have a technical issue here. Hopefully we'll overcome it. I'm aware that one of our speakers today, who's graciously agreed to be part of our discussion, our colleague here at Brown, Professor Barrymore Anthony Bogues, Assessor of Humanities and Professor of Africana Studies, and Director of the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice, has to depart from the meeting at 11:45. So I'm going to propose that I hand over the floor to my colleague Yannis to conduct an interview with Professor Bogues, drawing from his rich research on the intellectual, political, cultural, and artistic legacy of Haiti and the Haitian Revolution, its reception and meaning globally. I think I will pick up after the interview and offer you my introduction. Yannis.
As Vangelis said, we have invited our colleague here at Brown, Professor Barrymore Tony Bogues, to participate in a discussion on the issue of Haiti. We chose to do that because, as many of you know, there is already significant discussion, especially in Greece, on the connection between Haiti. Haitian Revolution was the key event, not only for the Atlantic world, but also for European societies, especially European colonial powers, and for the world as a whole. So could you start by telling us what was the event that we call the Haitian Revolution?
Thank you all very much for inviting me, and I hope we can sort out our technical problems. This is part of living in a Zoom world, so it's I understand. I think it's important to understand the Haitian Revolution as a world historic event, as an event which happened in 1791 to 1805. In which rearranged, I would argue, the way in which the European colonial as well as the Atlantic world was organized. Anna Arendt makes the point in her book on revolution that revolutions are really about new beginnings. I always like to add to that, not just new beginning, but revolutions themselves pose new questions. And that within the Haitian Revolution, what makes it world historical is that it posed the question of the social in a very profound way. Because racial slavery and colonialism are not just political and economic arrangements, they're also very much social arrangements. They're about how our society is organized. And so what the Haitian Revolution did was that it created a breach in the world in the 1700s, in the 18th century world, created a breach against colonialism and against racial slavery, because that's how the Atlantic world was organized. Many scholars, as you all will know, will point to the French Revolution as the kind of world historical event of the period 1789. But I would want to suggest that 1791, the Haitian Revolution, was a world historic revolution, a world historical event, because what it did was that it actually opened up the breach to what were the major societal formations at that point in time, in a way in which the French Revolution was not able to do. In other words, it put on the table of human society certain questions about racial slavery, about colonialism. The French Revolution, for all its extraordinary and richness and remarkableness, did not do that. So I think that's what we are looking at. And added to that, I think, is that when it puts on the table the questions of national independence, anti-colonialism, it also put on the table the question of Black sovereignty. And I think this is important. So it's not just sovereignty and in national independence in a way in which, say, the American War of Independence did of 1776. This was the business of Black sovereignty. And so it was the ways in which those who were racialized, those who were deemed to be not humans, now had the situation where they were now creating a society in which they could create a certain amount of sovereignty. And that notion of sovereignty, I think, of Black sovereignty, was something that was anathema to the Western world, to European colonialism, and to America. So that's what you're looking at. You're looking at this extraordinary event that displaces and rearranges and does both political as well as epistemic breaks, I would argue, as to how the world can be organized.
Thank you very much, Tony. That was a wonderful introduction to the whole theme. Can we follow on from that and discuss the reaction, especially the reaction in Europe? We know that it set into motion a series of events, some military, some political, some diplomatic. And we also know that it actually shaped people's thinking in different ways also in Europe. So could you tell us, for example, how did France react to that event?
Because it is a world historic event and because it breached the ways in which the world was organized at that point in time, there was, as you say, there was really different ranges of reactions. One of the fascinating things I've found in doing my research, I was in Amsterdam about 2 years ago, working on a particular project and going through a set of newspapers when I suddenly came upon a newspaper published in French that was being published in Leiden at the time, in the 1700s. And it was filled with reports of the Haitian Revolution, including the public reproduction of the Declaration of Independence in 1805. And that was, to me, amazing. And the letters to the editor and the editorial comment showed both sides. There was those who said this is an important event, we should support it. And then there were those who said, listen, and I think this was a dominant reaction. Why are you publishing this? This is dangerous to us as Europeans. And so I think that certainly for France and Europe, that there would have been those who felt, okay, the revolution is worth supporting, but there were also those who felt that no, this revolution is a breach. And I want to use Napoleon's words here, who made the point in a letter to the British Council in the United States that what we have to fear is not so much, Napoleon says, the actual factor of slave revolts. Those, he says, we can put down. What we have to fear, he says, is the specter of the blacks who can rule. That's what we have to fear. And I think that therefore this business of the specter of black sovereignty is really what was fearful. And the French reacted by saying that we will not recognize you unless you pay us 150 million francs at that point in time. And this is really remarkable in my view. The request of the French was that the demand of the French was that you pay 150 million francs for the property we have lost, including the slaves that we have lost. So here you have a situation where France is negotiating with the new rulers of Haiti, and they are saying to them, we owned you, and we now, for your freedom, you now have to pay us this, 50 million francs, because we're not just talking about property in terms of land and plantations. We're talking about property in terms of human beings. Then there were the other important reaction, I think, which is really important, is how the revolution actually quickened the abolition process, so that you can't think about the British abolition movement and the ending of the slave trade, which is in 1807, 1808 from the British colonial side, without not thinking about Haiti. In other words, the arguments that were being made is that if we don't do this, then what we are going to do is that we're going to have another Haiti. What some writers have called the Haitian fear. And it's a fear of Black sovereignty and obviously slave revolution. And so that the process of abolition was then quickened because of that. The other thing I think is important is that to understand is that it then meant that it inspired slaves everywhere. This is not just in Europe, but in around the Atlantic world. So that, for example, when you get to the American Civil War, there are troops, segregated Black regiments fighting, but calling themselves like Toussaint Louverture, who was the leader of the first leader of the Haitian Revolution. And then the Haitian Revolution gave help to Simon de Bolivar, on the condition that when he won independence for Venezuela, he would free the slaves. So there's a certain kind of internationalism, and as you all know, that there was a letter of support from Boyer to the Greek revolutionaries in France, saying, we support you, we can't give you arms at this point in time, but we will give you, because of all our own difficulties, but we will give you all the political solidarity support that you have. And it is something that you have discussed with me, but also I think people like Sadia Abbas has written about when she talks about Greek independence. So that there is what I would think is to think, when I think about Haitian Revolution and international reaction, what I think about is how the Haitian Revolution practiced a certain kind of Black abolition internationalism at that time, and how that Black abolitionist internationalism, which included, because Black sovereignty and anti-slavery, obviously, how Europe reacted to that. That's what you're looking at. But so it's not just a reaction to the revolution and Black sovereignty, but to a certain kind of Black abolition internationalism that they practice. I mean, it is one of the things that C.L.R. James points that C.L.R. James makes in Black Jacobins, his remarkable book on the revolution, is how, in fact, Toussaint was thinking about creating an army, a naval army that would go to Africa and actually stop the slave trade. So that there is no doubt that you are looking at a world historical event that has international repercussions, but also simultaneously practices a certain kind of radical internationalism, which we don't mention, but which I think is really important to think about middle 19th century world.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much, Tony. I mean, there are lots of interesting issues you brought up in your comment right now, including the letter that was written by prominent intellectuals, scholars, and revolutionaries in Paris, of Greek origin, advocating for the Greek War of Independence. We're going to talk about it later, but I just want to stay a little bit on the reactions by intellectuals in Europe who had endorsed the ideas of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, who had endorsed the anti-monarchist and the tyrannical kind of feeling in Europe. How did they react to the Haitian Revolution and the prospect and the specter of Black sovereignty Did they endorse it, or did they think it was a bit too much compared to what they had before agreed in terms of the declaration?
I think that what you are looking at is the following, Yannis, and that's a really great point. I think that there were many, let's call them radical intellectuals at that point in time, particularly in France, Jacobins, who were supportive of the Haitian Revolution when it abolished slavery. I think it's important the way to think about frame the Haitian Revolution this way. I frame it as a dual revolution. That is, this is about the abolition of slavery, and it's for struggle for national liberation. It's one of the bitterest struggles for national liberation, and has to be seen within the context of national liberation struggles worldwide. I think radical folk, particularly Jacobins and those who are supportive of the French Revolution, thought that, okay, the ending of slavery is fine. But the question of the end of colonialism is deeply problematic. And so that when you read, even when Danton and the others are in the National Assembly, and there's a debate about the ending of slavery, and the National Assembly finally agrees, led by the Jacobins, finally agrees, okay, we are going to go ahead with the abolition of slavery. What do? They say, we agree with it. We passed a resolution that we agree with this, but we are going to let's put the resolution to the public committee, two committees, the Public Committee of Safety and the Committee on Colonies. So, and what is interesting, right, in that moment is, we all know what the Public Safety Committee was, the committee, the kind of radical committee of the French Revolution. But it was also the Committee of Colonies, and there was nothing on their minds about, okay, let's abolish colonialism as well. So that I would argue is the kind of nub of the matter. In other words, that for many European intellectuals, even radical ones, slavery, yeah, let's get rid of it. It's fine. We don't want to do that. But the idea of colonialism was not anathema to them. People saw that colonialism was a kind of logical part of Europe's and particularly in this case French, kind of French Enlightenment and so on, and French civilization and European civilization. In other words, there was an understanding of hierarchical classificatory understanding of who was human and who was not. Yes, we do not want to have slaves, but colonialism, now there are two things with that. One, there is the commercial aspects of it, which I think a lot of people would be worried about, that because that means we will lose our colonies, and colonies were prestigious things, even for radicals, I would argue, at that particular moment in European history. But also the idea that somehow to be part of a colony was an overseas colony was that you were on what I like to call you were on the ladder of civilization. So that therefore if you're a colonized subject, you could be civilized over time. All right. So slavery abhorrent, but colonialism, no. It also had a civilization project, and part of the even radical intellectuals. Well, let's continue the civilizational project.
Right. Thank you. That's great. I think it relates to lots of our discussions, both in this panel and also in the conference as a whole. The fact that the issue of colonialism and also of property and of the extraction, of course, and the exploitation that was going on in the colonies was central, and even radicals could not really let go of that as an idea, that we still have a vested interest in the colonies as economic asset, as a production, as a kind of wealth that we cannot relinquish. I know you have to go soon, so I want to pose the final two brief questions, I hope. The first is to do with the concept of white slavery. We discussed it briefly together a couple of days ago, and I was telling you that one of the concepts we are seeing emerging in Europe, but also you tell me in North America, following the Haitian Revolution is the idea that, hey, here in Europe, we have another cause, and that's the cause of white slavery. So perhaps we should focus our efforts in helping, let's say, people in Greece liberate themselves from the slavery of the Ottoman Empire and not so much worry about what's happening in the Caribbean. So I want to ask you to develop that kind of notion a bit further. What was that about? And how does it relate to what was happening in other parts, let's say in North America?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an important question, because there are several things. Firstly, I think one wants to make a distinction, a very careful analytical distinction in understanding that racial slavery that I'm talking about, which emerges through the Atlantic world and parts of European colonial project, is grounded in anti-Black racism. That's the first thing, that it is not just slavery in a Black skin. It is slavery that is very much grounded in in a certain hierarchical understanding of who's human, who is not, and the ways in which Blackness is understood as inferior, lack, and disposable. Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing I would want to put on the table is that it seems very clear to me that in 18th and 19th century political language, that there was people made a set of distinctions in which to be colonized was also to be slaves. But it was a different kind of slavery. It was slavery that was attached to lack of political representation, lack of a certain kind of political participation. It wasn't racial and chattel slavery in the way that I've tried to carefully demarcate in my first comment. And so that when you look at the Indian-American Revolution, so you take, for example, one of the most important pamphlets, the most popular pamphlets, written by a man called Hopkins from Rhode Island, who was one of the first chancellor of this university, and it's about the rights of the colonists, and what he's arguing for is that the American who are here, people who have become Americans, have a right to independence, and that if they are not independent, they are going to continue to be slaves to the King of England, and use the word slaves. He himself was a slave owner, but he doesn't talk about the people who owned the slave. He didn't see them as human beings. What he saw was that the word slavery then became a lack of what? Lack of political liberty. And lack of the capacity of the Americans to have to say, so it was, or to tax themselves, because part of the slogan of the War of Independence was about what? No taxation without representation. So that slavery therefore becomes a kind of metaphor, a capacious metaphor that captures different forms, capture that form of domination, a kind of way in which we think about dependency. So because if you don't have representation, political representation or forms of political equality, then there's a certain kind of dependency. We have to make that distinction when people talk about that and say white slavery and a kind of racial slavery, which is a system of almost total domination. The distinction that I would want to make is a distinction that Du Bois makes in his book, Black Reconstruction. He says that the way in which we need to understand, racial slavery, he doesn't use the word racial slavery, but the way we need to understand slavery in America, he says, is that you are under the arbitrary will of somebody. Right? So you're not now, it's not about political representation, it's that your entire life is under the arbitrary will of somebody. And somebody can wake up on the wrong side of the bed this morning and say, you must do this and you have to do that. Somebody can wake up on this morning and say, I thought I saw you doing something wrong. I'm going to beat you to death and whip you, and you have no recourse. So this business of arbitrary will and the exercise of the arbitrary will as a form of domination over a human being is, I think, at the heart of this thing, because, and tied to that, I would argue, is that then this person becomes a thing. This person becomes an object.
Yeah.
And this person then is both, is what I would like to call, is what I call in my writings, this particular black body experiences double commodification, because he or she is a thing bought and sold in this business of the commerce of human beings, but he or she also produces a set of commodities which is then bought and sold on the market.
Yeah.
So I think we have to be really very careful and nuanced to understand that, you know, the question of slavery, of racial slavery, is a distinctive form of human domination that we mustn't confuse with and conflate with other forms of domination and servitude.
That's great. Thank you very much. And I think this is crucial for us as we discuss the Greek War of Independence, when the idea of slavery has been used very freely, and as you say, without reference to the distinctions that are key to be made. And I hope I'll say a word or two in relation to that in a minute. But I want to finish with a final short question. What would it mean today, in the era of Black Lives Matter, to rewrite the history of the world, especially the 18th and 19th century, from the point of view of the Haitian Revolution? Because as you said, and as we know, it was written starting from the French Revolution or the American Revolution. What do we need to decenter that discourse and say, let's rewrite it from the point of view of Haiti?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And the way I would, if I could answer it in two ways. First way is the question that I ask myself in my work. What would it mean to tell the history of the world and the history of capitalism, which I am concerned with, not from the point of view of Manchester, but from the point of view of the slave ship? Mm-hmm. What kind of new kind of historiographies would we need to begin to think about if we do that? And so, if by extension we begin to tell a history of the world as well, from the 18th and 19th centuries, about questions of political modernity, which is what one is talking about, from the Haitian Revolution, point of view Haitian Revolution, then how will the world look? And I would argue that what the question that is put on the table very much by the Haitian Revolution, the dual Haitian Revolution, is a question of freedom. And it's not a question of political liberty or a political equality. It is a question of what does freedom look like, or what can it look like? Because one of the things that happened in the Haitian Revolution, and we don't have Haitian Revolution, and we don't have time for that, is that how internally the revolution becomes complicated because it does not answer that question. For all sorts of reasons, such as, it has external problems, and people are faced, this might be invasion here and so on. The Americans occupy, from in the beginning of the 20th century for 15 years. So, I mean, they're all those kind of questions, all those kind of issues that face it. So this is not a kind of blank critique about, what is it that people could and should have done. But and revolutions are never smooth. And if you have a revolution as world historic, that's creating that kind of breach, it is going to face all sorts of difficulties. But it is just part of the social process of human life. But certainly the question that was posed, I think, by the Haitian enslaved men and women was, what kind of freedom do we have? Because what they wanted to do was to get rid of the plantation itself, not just to be freed from slavery, but to get rid of the plantation itself, and to then begin to think about, okay, what kind of alternative forms of economic activity can we have, and different forms of association can we have? And to me, that is that those are kind of thinking about practices of freedom. And so that in the world today, in my view, if you begin to think about the Haitian Revolution, it's not about sentimentality, but it is about trying to think about, okay, What are the questions that were put on the table in this revolution that may not have been answered, and that how those questions may still be relevant for our world today?
That's wonderful. Thank you very much. I think we'll have to stop here. You have to go, but this has been very, very interesting for all of us, extremely illuminating, and we're very grateful, Tony. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for asking me. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Vangelis, over to you.
Yannis, I think we'll proceed as planned with a comment from you as to the significance of some of these comments around the Haitian Revolution for the Greek case.
Yes. How long do I have, Vangelis? Because I know we are considerably behind. So,
5 minutes or so, and then we'll move.
Okay.
We'll move to Sakis. I'll introduce Sakis quickly, and then we'll move to Sakis.
Absolutely. Thank you. I will stay within the 5 minutes. So, as we heard already from Tony, we're dealing with a global event that actually places race, and especially Black anti-racism, anti-Black racism within our agenda of thinking about Europe, thinking about revolution, and thinking about Greece as well. And I want to spend my 5 minutes or 4 minutes now discussing how the issue of Haiti was actually is being received in Greece right now, because I think on its own, the discussion about Haiti right now within the celebrations and discussions about revolution is extremely illuminating. So if I can just very briefly share my screen and show you 2 images, that will, I think, make my point without too many words. So Haiti is actually being played out very, very prominently, especially within the left-wing press in Greece. Syriza newspapers, I've seen Efemeritus and Dacton and other media by left-wing intellectuals and politicians. What's interesting is that there is a narrative that's been circulated about Haiti, which actually does not correspond to the historical truth. So reference is made to the letter we talked about briefly before, the letter that Corais and others wrote to Boyer, the president of Haiti, asking for financial help in the Greek War of Independence. And of course, we know the letter, we've seen the letter, we also seen the response saying clearly that we empathize, we connect with you because of the Greek heritage as well, and because we also were under tyranny for many years. But we cannot offer you financial help or offer you ammunition or people to fight because of our own internal problems. Now, if you read many of the articles in the Greek press today, you will see that there's a constant repetition of the phrase that Haiti sent 100 volunteers who did not make it to Greece because they drowned or they died on the way to Greece. It also sent 45 tons of coffee to be sold to fund the War of Independence. Now, both narratives are very interesting, are very touching, but of course, there is no historical evidence for it. And I've never seen anything that actually proves that. Why is it then so important for us to make that connection? I think it's interesting to see how left-wing intellectuals want to connect with the non-Western world or a world that's non-European, and also with the legacy that relates to Black emancipation. But at that point in the discourse in the Greek War of Independence today, on the War of Independence today, becomes less a discussion about slavery and race, and more a discussion about the impact of the Greek War itself, how important the event in Greece was that actually encouraged people in Haiti or touched them to send this support. So instead of discussing, as we did with Tony, the global impact of the Haitian War and the related issues of slavery, anti-Black racism, and emancipation, we discuss within a triumphalist and nationalist manner very often how important the Greek War of Independence was. So that's my first point, very brief point. My second point, however, is that race irrespective of Haiti or not, should be a central issue in the discussion about the Greek War of Independence. And unfortunately, it's not at the moment. It's been discussed, as we said, only in those terms. It is important and crucial because we take it for granted that Greece was a white country. And we forget, of course, that it was a country in connection with the world, what was happening in many other countries in the Eastern Mediterranean, what was happening in Northern Africa and other places. We know that the Ottomans had moved populations from many parts into Greece. We know that there was extensive slave trade in Greece. We know that there were many African communities and Black communities living in Greece during the war, at the time of the War of Independence. All these things are things that are not really debated and discussed. And it is key to see how the intellectual, discursive, and political processes that actually fed into the War of Independence resulted in not only in the Europeanization of the country, but also in the whitening of the country. At a time when Black slavery, at a time when emancipation was at the center of attention in Europe and the world as a whole. And I made a reference in my discussion to Tony to white slavery. This is in fact a term that has been used by a number of people, including by Phil-Hellenists, especially by Chateaubriand in his writings. He was very keen to actually juxtapose what was happening, let's say, in Britain with the 1807 Abolition Act, the idea that Greeks here in Europe are the white slaves, and we have to go and help them because that's the important cause for liberals right now, not what's happening in the Caribbean and in Haiti. And of course, he himself was, as Tony said, one of the radicals who actually did not want to let the empire go, not want to let the colonies go for obvious reasons. So that's what I wanted to say. I think it's key for us to introduce notions of race, racism, anti-Black racism into the discussion of revolution, not see it only as a political process of emancipation from the Ottoman yoke, as it's been called. Thank you.
Let us move now to Professor Sakis Gekas, who's Hellenic Heritage Foundation Chair of Modern Greek History at York University in Toronto, Canada. Sakis is the author, among other works, of Xenocracy, State, Class and Colonialism in the Ionian Islands, 1815 to 1864. Indeed, his monograph has been translated into Greek and appeared in print from EAS, the Hellenic Open University Press, just this summer. In it, Sakis surveys a white colony in the Mediterranean, the Ionian state, like Malta, Gibraltar, and later Cyprus, where the British shared sovereignty and administration with the Ionian locals. Did this ordeal, Gekas asks, engender dependency and anticipate the neo-colonial condition with which the Greek nation struggles until this day? So in looking at the interlaced issues of coloniality, race, and nation, I invite Sakis to take his full 15 minutes.
Thank you, Vangelis and Yannis, for the invitation and the organizing committee of the collective. It's a wonderful panel already, and I look forward very much to listening to you and Konstantina as well. I would start a little bit differently than what I planned, following from what Yannis said about, and Vangelis, about the white colony. The British devised a system of registering goods, people, generally colonial information, statistical information, as I understood it at the time, in the so-called blue books of statistics. So while they were doing that, they included the Ionian Islands, though they sent the same books and same pages in the Ionian Islands as well for people to fill in. But of course, the category colony and the columns slaves or whites were left empty. So immediately for the colonial mind, let's say, and in the colonial archive, there is a clear understanding of those under British protection at the time are whites. They're not, they're not slaves by any colonial office definition, at least. So the 200 years anniversary that is kind of drawing to a close has provided an excellent opportunity to revisit and review the place of the Greek Revolution, this defining moment of the nation and the country, so to speak, in relations to geographies and genealogies of European colonialism, to quote from the Decolonizing Initiative project's main goal. Now, some historians, not only those of us who work within the context of European empires and British colonialism in particular, and its entanglement with Greek history, but also historians of other empires, the Russian and the French, for example, took the opportunity and provided new interpretations that change our understanding of the big event and place it within a comparative and international framework, whether in the history of liberalism and the liberal revolutions of the first half of the 20th century, the history of Philhellenism in the US, or the Ottoman perceptions of the Greek Revolution based on sources in the Ottoman Turkish language, something that was largely missing until recently. So there you have it. You have sort of the traditional, let's say, European empires, British and French and Russian. You have the US, an empire in the making, perhaps in the 1823 Monroe Doctrine onwards. And of course, the sort of the 8 centuries old empire, the Ottoman one, from which the Greek state emerges out of not a colony, of course, but as a sort of as a successor state. None of the approaches, however, of the sort of very welcome that I mentioned above, automatically related or can lead to a project of understanding the role of colonialism in Greek history, or rather the colonial past of Greek history. Now, historians of empire, of course, are more likely to talk about decolonization as well, because they have studied the power relations and the unequal structures that emerged, or rather were imposed by the colonizers. Now, a sort of disclaimer, decolonization has different meanings, and I think that applies to today as well as to the past. Where I am, for example, in Canada, decolonizing education, the health system, and means basically engaging seriously with the systemic racism that even abused generations of First Nations, Métis, and broadly indigenous peoples in schools, universities, research centers, and government. So this is what decolonizing the curriculum, the education system, and the health system means. Nonetheless, we can distinguish, in a way of sort of bringing history in the discussion and trying to see if history can help in any way, put it bluntly. We can distinguish between phases of Greek history in which there were attempts to transform into a colonial empire, episodes far and few in between, I would say, starting from the Crimean War in the 1850s, 1853-56, all the way perhaps to the Greek dictatorship's attempt to forcibly unite Cyprus since 1974 by deposing Makarios. But back in the 19th century, it was not so much colonial expansion as part of the Megali Idea, of course, but it was rather trying to benefit from other empires' expansion projects. And cases where Greece and its people have been subjected, on the other hand, to some form of colonial rule. That's the other flip side of the coin. Some periods in the 20th century, perhaps, when Greece subjected its own population to discrimination, punitive, and oppressive measures, whether Slavophone or Jewish or other minorities. But really, Greece was on the side of the colonized in the broader sense. I think there will be little doubt about this, with the exception, perhaps, of the cases I mentioned in the 19th century and the Asia Minor campaign, and that's, again, debatable. Now, decolonizing is an inherently and unconditionally political project. It is therefore comprehensive, and to approach it from a historical methodology point of view requires an understanding of the conditions that created the Greek state and the forces that shaped it. And to some extent, historians have been doing that for a while. The three protecting powers in the wake of the Battle of Navarino and eventual independence in 1830. The guarantee of Greece's independence against the Ottoman Empire. It was a pact that broke in a shocking way to Greeks in the Crimean War and was followed by another shade of manifestation of colonial type of power relations, the International Financial Commission or control, which is something that we keep sort of experiencing in modern Greece all the way to the present. Another reason there has not been a colonial turn, so to speak, in Greek historiography, and therefore no in-depth projects to decolonize the Greek past or decolonize history, as Boaventura Sousa Santos mentioned earlier, is because historians of modern Greece are particularly reluctant, to an extraordinary point, to discuss class. They use the term elites, political interest groups, but rarely venture beyond this sort of political science established terminology. Although it is almost 50 years that Konstantinos Tsoukalas, talking about the Greek bankers of Constantinople, people like Syngros, for example, said that they colonized their own country. And thus, the comprador bourgeoisie was one of the first categories that was employed by Tsoukalas and others. And I think there was some sort of a lost opportunity there for Greek, thinkers, intellectuals, historians, and social scientists and political scientists. Since the term and the notion of semi-colonialism has been used for parts of the world, such as China, for example, that was by force, of course, brought into a Western, primarily British-dominated system of commercial exchange, which later on translated also to another form of financial control, the gold standard. Now, therefore, a lot of work has been done by historicizing the Greek state narrative, and historians, at least critical historians in Greece, nonetheless, Konstantina, Yannis, Vangelis, we've all been through a sort of, history department or a school of letters in Greece. Historians learn, in a way, or are taught how to deconstruct the nationalist narrative and the school-enforced stereotypes. But history of Greek state and a history of Greek regions where colonialism, protection, and dependency were not used in a metaphorical sense still needs to be integrated within national narrative. And we will probably see that this will make it less national or ethnocentric and much more relevant to other historiographies. Just as many scholars in the Middle East think of Napoleon's campaign to Egypt and the Eastern Mediterranean as the beginnings of some sort of beginnings of modernization in the Middle East, the arrival of the Republican French in the Ionian Islands in 1797, and their brief presence, but shattering in some ways, constitutes the beginnings of a Greek path to modernity, a political modernity for sure, even in a crooked line, not as a linear sort of straight line. Just as this Republican moment was cut short by the Russian-ruled Heptanisos Politia, the Septinsular Republic, and the French occupation by Napoleonic forces in 1807, 1814, for Corfu at least, it is during this period in the 19th century that the beginnings of Greek dependency and its colonial condition date, followed, of course, by a semi-colonial state that changed also during its life course under British protection in the Ionian Islands in 1814 until 1864. Now, British presence and interest in the regions paved the way for British intervention during the Greek Revolution. It is not just sort of a high diplomacy game between Britain, Russia, and France eventually, but it also conditions on the ground that forced the British to rethink their policy towards the Ottoman Empire, in particular towards the Greek Revolution. Now, I want to also bring in the notion, sort of old one, but hasn't really gone away at all, I think, of informal empire. And of course, it is, it's a standard approach. It's exercising economic hegemony characterized by asymmetric influence that was not maintained by force, but rather economic repercussions. And of course, discerning what an informal empire is can be quite challenging, and therefore what an informal colony is can be quite challenging because imperial relations are not as clear-cut, let's say, as having a colonial governor. Nonetheless, it is the case that a project to decolonize Greek history has to, so to speak, seriously engage with the historiography of decolonization in a much more direct engagement with histories of decolonization elsewhere. And a much larger view is needed to relate decolonization to globalization, because the 19th century and until the historic changes that we experience today, whether economic integration is called for or it does not go together with territorial integration. If this has not been, it is not necessary, let's say, anymore. I think it's also important to rethink this final point, because how does Greece and the Greek world, more broadly Greeks, fit in this context of globalization? Because neither in the colonization process nor the decolonization process was separate or distinct from globalization. And of course, there's definitions about it, but the expansion of European powers in the 18th and 19th century, perhaps posed in the Vienna Congress, took a new form in the European South with the Ionian Islands and later on Greece during the Greek Revolution. So while there was sort of this concert of agreement, the Greek Revolution really poses a challenge to European powers and forces them to shift their position. So if the creation of the Greek state out of a liberal revolution, a point that was made in recent discussions and publications about the big event, if this liberal revolution challenged the illiberal order of the times, then universal suffrage, first for men and then eventually for women, represents a major step in the decolonization process, if it is a political project above all. We should also note that there is also various stages of colonization and decolonization. It is not sort of everywhere a one-step process. But in any case, it is, and I want to conclude with that, it is much more than a matter of perceptions. And there's been a lot of discussions in the last 10 and now 11 years about whether Greece is a colony, is a dead colony, or a protectorate, which probably, I think, shapes the thinking to a certain extent of people behind this collective, behind this initiative. And finally, a few concluding remarks. Greek history, especially economic history, is fraught with a narrative of a successful trajectory of a small but resilient economy, a narrative that, while true to a certain extent, presents the following paradox. As the Greek economy has been integrating all the more into a globalizing and centralizing bloc, the EU, at the same time, it is becoming more dependent on international finance, with the recent crisis of now 10, 11 years, and its consequences to loom large for a very long time. And it was this kind of crisis and dependency, after all, that led to a renewed perception of Greece as a colony, a protectorate, or as it's sometimes called, a dead colony. Now, we should keep from historiographical reflections on the 200 years anniversary since the 2010s, the emphasis on this historically rather fragile, to say the least, character of Greek finances that sort of emerges out of a crisis, whether it's the 1850s or the 1890s or the 1920s or the 2010s, perhaps, with an association always with defense expenses, a sort of a project of nationalism, but not necessarily colonialism, and the direct intervention with international commissions of financial control, at least 3 in the last 170 years, and the conditions of dependency, if not exactly colonization, that have come with further integration of Greece to the empire of the day, the British in the 19th and early 20th century, the US in the post-war and Cold War period, and perhaps the European Union in the post-Maastricht era, 1990s onwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sakis. Let's move to Konstantina. Konstantina Zanou from the Department of Italian Studies and specializing in Mediterranean Studies at Columbia University in the city of New York. Konstantina has been gracious enough to come to us today to provide some commentary on our topic and on the presentations. She is well known for her award-winning book, Transnational Patriotism in the Mediterranean, 1800 to 1850, Stammering the Nation, a work that traces the transition from multiple empires to the nation in the region, and more particularly in the Adriatic space. Konstantina, we're going to push it right up to our timeline and go over. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Vangelis. Hi, I'm sorry, and thank you for inviting me to this panel. And I'm sorry that you didn't have the time to introduce the panel properly and share your thoughts, Vangelis. But I will be very brief, so you may have the time later. In this general commentary, I wanted to bring in 2 or 3 points, informative points that I have connecting the 2 main themes. On the one hand, race and the Greek Revolution, and on the other hand, the idea of coloniality and the Greek Revolution. So I will start with the case of Haiti and the Greeks mentioned by Yannis, and I want to add 2 or 3 points to that story, very well-known story, but I think a little bit misunderstood story. There are parts of the mosaic missing here, which I think are important for our understanding of the meaning of race in the Greek revolutionary context. So one important part of the story is that the letter written by Korai and his friends in Paris in 1821 was not actually written by him. It was an idea conceived by l'Abbé Grégoire, who was a very important figure of the French Revolution and of the battle for the emancipation of the slaves worldwide. One of the most important activists and intellectuals, but also an abbé. So he was also a very important activist in terms of religion. He had this view of the world that all Christian religions should be united and all people should be equal on the basis of the Christian religion. So we have to have this figure in mind, because he was the one who thought of putting together the 2 causes, the cause of the Greek Revolution and the cause of Haiti, which he was following very closely. He conceived the idea, he wrote the letter, I believe he was the one who wrote the letter, and gave it to this committee to sign it. Now we can give also, I can show also parts of the letter, but one of the important elements in the letter, I was reading it again yesterday in its original French, is that it never mentions the word black, or even the fact that these, of course, they mentioned the fact that these were former slaves, okay, but the major emphasis is on the fact that they are Christians. The fact that they are Christians, and on the basis of their common Christianity, they should be, in solidarity with another Christian nation. So one aspect here, which I find is important, is that when we discuss ideas of emancipation or freedom, of different forms of freedom, we have to see its connection to religion. Okay, so like how race is connected to religion in this case. Now, what Tony said was very important in helping me understand the whole conundrum here, because basically he said the word slavery is used both as, in order to describe racial slavery, but both as a metaphor. And in this letter specifically, I think that it is used as a metaphor because it is used mostly to describe also Greeks. Okay, and so it is very interesting how these 2 levels, various ideas of forms of unfreedom, of slavery, are mixed within the same text. However, even if these examples are used in a metaphorical sense, and we have one more I discovered yesterday looking into this book of the 1980s, η Αμερική και ο ρόλος στην επανάσταση του 1821, very, very important book. I didn't know about it. It's like a combination of sources. And I discovered another important letter by the same group at the same time, coordinated by Grégoire, actually a letter to the men of the American Republic. And they tell the Americans, I can show also a passage if you want, they tell them that, you have freed your slaves, so help us free ourselves from the Ottoman tyranny. So it's very interesting that they use this metaphor for that. But on the other hand, we have some figures in the revolution, like Bishop Ignatius of Pisa, who was really very interested in the cause of the liberty, of the freedom of the racial slavery of the blacks. And he has written things about that. and he has connected it to the freedom of the Greeks. So he doesn't speak in metaphorical terms about slavery. He actually speaks about the racial slavery. So we have also intellectuals during the revolution who are interested really in that issue. Ignatius was living in Pisa. In northern Italy, central northern Italy. At the same time, in 1815, you have some important works about the emancipation of the slaves, who emphasize the Haitian example. And I'm talking about, for example, the treatise by Andrea Zambelli, Sulla schiavitù dei negri, who actually talks. I think I can share my screen here. What do you think? So I show some of these images. Let's see if I make it. I'm not sure I can do it. Yeah. Let me see. No, it doesn't let me do it. I'm sorry. It doesn't recognize. It doesn't let me do it. Anyway, let me continue then without showing the passages. In any case, it's important that we see intellectual developments in specific circles in Greece during the revolution, with developments at the same time in Italy. And Ignatius was very much the link between these two worlds. And so the attention that Haiti received in certain liberal circles in Italy at the time was very important for these intellectuals in Greece to discuss race. It's a work that has to be done. We haven't done enough yet. Now, I want to somehow conclude my commentary with some big questions I want to put on the table here. I don't expect that we will answer them, but I want to pose them. So the first big question I have is this: what is the meaning of race in the Greek context before the mid-19th century? From the mid-19th century onwards, we have these important theories, Combinot and others. And there is an important book about that, actually, Φυλετικές Θεωρίες στην Ελλάδα, published recently, about racial theories in Greece from mid-19th century onwards. But what's the meaning of race, φυλή, or genos, or whatever you want to call it, in the Greek context of the beginning of the 19th century? What's the connection, if there is any, of the meaning of race to slavery or to subjugation or unfreedom of any kind? Does race mean anything about your condition in relation to freedom? The second big question I have connected to this is, what is the meaning of slavery in the Atlantic context and in the Mediterranean context? And I think Tony mentioned some of these things. In the Mediterranean context, you have, you have slaves, you have captives, you have different forms of serfdom. How are these, how are these different in their own terms as slavery, and how all this said of unfreedom is different even from the idea that Tony said, the subjugation, the political subjugation, not having political freedom. Okay, so there are different forms of unfreedom in terms of an individual, like different forms of slavery, but there are also different forms of non-political unfreedom, let's say. These are not equal and they are not the same, and we have to think about these differences if we are to talk about these issues in the transatlantic context and the Mediterranean context. Final set of questions I have, and this is something that also Sakis discusses in his book very well, it's what's the meaning of colony in the period? What's the meaning of colony? What's the meaning of an independent state for the period? to make it even more general, what's the meaning of sovereignty? So I wouldn't take these issues for granted, and Sakis does really a very good job in showing that at the period there are different levels of perception of sovereignty and also colonialism, and these different levels were not always opposed by the main protagonists, by the colonized themselves. Actually, we know very well there are many liberals at the time in the Ionian Islands, in Greece, and everywhere in the Mediterranean, who think that a protection by a wider colony, a bigger empire or colonial power like Britain or France would be beneficial for national independence. It would be a guarantee, if you want, for national independence. And also we hear Tony that said that many radicals already from the French Revolution, but even later in the 19th century, were very much pro-colonial. They would, they would think that these issues are very much independent from one another. So I believe that we have to start discussing these issues. Already some issues among these are discussed, but when we discuss them, we really have to look into the very specific terms we discuss these very big ideas in the Mediterranean context of the 19th century. Thank you.
Let me take 3 or 4 minutes to provide you with a coda, a lyrical, dramatic, or musical conclusion to our investigation of coloniality, race, and nation, and perhaps also end with a proposal for the future. Maybe we can turn to Delacroix's painting of Greece on the ruins of Messaloniki. At its first exhibition in France in 1826, the admission fee was earmarked not for some general Philhellenic fund or war chest, but more specifically to pay for the return of women and children abducted during the siege. Our gaze then on this picture might dwell less on the monumental whiteness of the allegorical female figure of Greece in the foreground, Solomos's great-hearted megalopsyche mother rising from the ruins, but rather the black fighter haunting from the periphery and threatening to reconfigure this forlorn and pallid mother to a potential sex object. In her seminal book, Extremities, Painting Empire in Post-Revolutionary France, the art historian Darcy Grigsby Grimaldo has explored the trajectories leading outwards from this field of vision. Flying the crescent here in the background is no swarthy Turk. This figure looming over a Christian woman is a black man, an Egyptian from Ibrahim Pasha's forces, a sub-Saharan African, an Arab, a Mameluke subject of an Ottoman master, a disproportionately economy-sized, in this picture, slave, who is on the verge of becoming himself a master over other slaves? Does his presence, Grimaldo asks, portend that this white woman's destined captivity will be in a harem, overseen by a black eunuch, wielding the power delegated from an Ottoman master? How would the French audience in 1826 have perceived this figure, and how would they react to the helplessness of white slavery, something that Professor Bogues touched on earlier? Is this a Barbary pirate, ubiquitous and predatory in the Mediterranean of the time? Or only 1 year after a French colony had gained its independence, a black sovereign state, how did this event a world away inform perspectives on the Greek cause? If the Greeks, once so grand, now so depressed, were to be crushed who would replace them? Haiti, Egypt, the Ottoman Empire, and Greece were here interlaced, whiteness and blackness, and nation so much so too in revolution. I'm very sorry that the technical glitches disallow the possibility of discussion amongst us, but I'd like, with Yannis's permission, to extend an invitation to our speakers today, and perhaps a couple of further commentators in the future to digest everything that is being recorded here and pick it up in a second meeting sometime in the very near future. I hope we all can agree on this. I'd like to thank everybody, particularly Professor Bogues, who had to leave early, and all our speakers, Sakis, Konstantina, Yannis, and hope to see you all soon in this stream on nation and race in the Decolonial Initiative. Thank you very much.